All right, so let's dive into sensory, perception, and attention. So, what is the sensory register? So, the sensory register, also called sensory memory, refers to the most and ultra short term immediate form of memory that you have. So, referring to the first and most immediate form of memory that we have. The sensory register is the ultra short term memory that takes in sensory information through our five senses. So through our sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And that's how our brains process these senses, these five information from these five senses, and make sense of it in our brain. And it holds it for no more than just a few seconds in an uncoded form, in a raw form. And so there isn't much processing happening yet, but it's how we as humans take in information that we experience in the world. And so it's the sensory register that enables you to remember sensory stimuli after your exposure to the stimuli has ended. So in thinking about where we are within the information processing system, we're first talking about sensory register. So this red part over here. So we take in information or stimulus from the environment through our five senses. So information is flowing into our brains, and we use our sensory register to take in that information from our five senses. And oftentimes, if we're not going to be using it, if it's not necessarily being used or important, it's often unattended or unattended. Often that information that is unattended is then lost or forgotten. And so we are constantly being bombarded with different kinds of sensory information, and we can't absorb all of it, nor do we care to. You can imagine let's say you're in a lecture hall and you are listening to the professor lecture about something, but maybe at the same time you have on your left or on your right you have friends that are talking, you have friends that are planning out their weekend, they're thinking about which clubs they're going to hit up, or maybe they're thinking they're on Amazon and they're shopping, and you're seeing all of these different kinds of sensory information happening, but you are just trying to focus on the lecture and the lecturer and the instructor and the information that's being processed and the information that's being conveyed to you so that you can learn. So you can imagine there are all kinds of sensory information that is happening all at the same time, and we're being bombarded with it all the time at any given point. But most sensory information is really not viewed as valuable information, so we discard it. Sort of like you have an email inbox with maybe like 20,000 emails in there. But maybe only like three or four of those emails are actually important. The rest are maybe junk emails or advertisements or shopping lists. We're not necessarily concerned with all of that kind of information because it's not necessarily relevant. So if we view something as valuable, and that information will then move into our working memory. So again, sensory register, we experience stimulus through our five senses. And then if we see that information or we view that information as valuable, we selectively attend, we pay attention to that information, which then it moves into our working memory. And it does this through this process of selective attention. So before we go into what selective attention is, I have a question for you all. For example, when I see my professor come into the lecture hall with a comb over, tattoos, wearing shades, flip-flops, Adidas soccer pants, and maybe 7 Leaves boba, and you remember what he or she looked like for just a second of observation, this is an example of what kind of memory? So the answer here is sensory memory. Again, sensory register or sensory memory is the shortest term element of memory. Roughly speaking, it concerns memories that last no more than a second or two. And it's coded in this, and it's processed. We take in that information in an uncoded or raw form. And that's why we're able to kind of take in all these different kinds of characteristics here. So I mentioned something called selective attention, but what exactly is it? Selective attention is the process of directing our awareness to relevant stimuli while ignoring irrelevant stimuli in the environment. So earlier I gave the example of being in the lecture hall, trying to pay attention to the instructor and the lecturer while there are abundance of different things that are happening at any given point in a lecture hall. Like I said, someone talking about their plans for the weekend, or maybe someone's shopping on Amazon, or maybe someone's like having a heart to heart with another student. Like there's a bunch of different things that can go on, but let's say you're trying to direct your awareness to the relevant stimuli. And the mechanism that allows us to do that, to process that information, is through selective attention. However, there is a limit to how much information can be processed at any given point. And selective attention allows us to tune out those insignificant details and focus on what is important. So I have a visual diagram here that sort of visualizes and pinpoints this idea of selective attention. At any given point, we can have all kinds of numerous sensory inputs. And in sort of thinking about it sort of like a wine glass bottle, we have so many inputs. These are these arrows that are coming in, but our brains only care to selectively attend to a few. And so the output on this side, you can see it's a lot more narrower, and there's only about one arrow or two arrows that are flowing out into the information that is attended to. So the limited capacity for paying attention has been conceptualized as a bottleneck, which restricts the flow of information. The narrower the bottleneck, the lower the rate of flow. So our brains aren't adapted to be processing 1,000 different things at once in a given situation. We're not necessarily like computers in that way that are able to process all of these inputs. So that's where that kind of metaphor does kind of fall into a trap a little bit. But what we're trying to showcase here is that our brains are sort of like a bottleneck. Information flows through our sensory register, and in order for it to get into the working memory, we use this process of selective attention to tune out the insignificant details that allows us to focus on the relevant information. And so to sort of test this in practice, I have a picture here, two pictures, one on the left, one on the right. I wonder if you can spot the difference between spot some of the differences between these two pictures. Great. So now that you've had some time to kind of look at this and maybe analyze the two different photos a little bit, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are here. So I'm going to point out some differences, and maybe you saw some of these differences too. So some of these differences include the shadows of the tree. The shadows of the tree are a little bit different. You might see like the pattern on the tree branches are a little bit different. You'll also might notice that the background here on the left and the right of that sort of rotunda dome is a little bit different. Another thing you might notice is here, this is one of the first things I noticed, the canvases of the buildings are a little bit different. You also might notice that the shoe colors are a little bit different, or the positions and the shading is a little bit different, or even some of the colors are a little bit different. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we as humans selectively attend to different kinds of informations. Here we're using our sense of eyesight to notice some of the differences, but you can see how this is an example of how we are selectively attending to different things based on what we're seeing relative to that individual.